Welcome back, Wonders. It's Naidra. Season 7 is here, and I'm super excited to be back to Diablo 4. I'm especially excited to test out the class balances that they've done from the PTR over into the actual season. And so for this season, I plan to try out all of the different character classes, starting with the Spiritborn first. What better way to test out the Spiritborn than coming off of a really hot season for that specific class? And so for today, we're going to go ahead and go through our very first T1 to T4 build for the Spiritborn, which is the Razorwing build. I've been having a lot of fun with this and was able to breeze pretty easily through all of the content, getting all the way up to T4. Now, with that said, I will be posting an updated endgame version of this, which will require some mythic uniques. But for this particular version, you don't need to have any mythic uniques, and you really don't even need any uniques at all. But there is one that we will be using, which is helpful, but is not necessary. And so before we dive into it, if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please don't forget to do so below. This will really greatly help me out and also allow me to continue to make videos like this. So let's go ahead and dive right in. And before we jump into the T4 demo, I just want to show you guys really quick what this can do in T3. You literally don't really have to push any buttons besides just using your toxic skin and walking through your enemies. So let's take a look and see really quick what that would look like here in T3. And again, I'll show you guys a quick demo in T4 right after this so you can see what the actual Razor Wings do as well. But when you're using this in any other world tier besides T4, you can literally just walk through monsters without having to use any other buttons besides just your toxic skin. If you want to go through it even quicker, you could use something else or use maybe your vortex, but you really don't need to. So this makes your gaming experience just that much easier, and it makes it that much easier to get on up to T4. Again, there are some areas of opportunity for this build, and there's definitely some things that we can optimize as we continue to build on it. But in the earlier world tiers, this is probably the easiest build that you can possibly use where you're not having to do any type of button mashing. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and jump over to T4 and show you guys what it looks like there. All right, and so before we dive into this, the way that this build is going to work is we're going to activate our Armored Hide. We'll then use our Vortex to pull our enemies in. We'll use Toxic Skin before we start spamming away on our Razor Wings. Before you use your last Razor Wing, you're going to want to use Counter Attack so we can deflect the Razor Wings back out. Then we'll proceed to using our last Razor Wing. Using our Hunter, we will be doing additional damage, and it'll be acting as a conduit for our Toxic Skin. But because we are using Intricacy with this specific build, it also will replenish the amount of Razor Wings that we have, allowing us to continue moving. So really, we can technically have an unlimited amount of Razor Wings depending on what our cooldown looks like, and also if we're using these skills in the correct order. That being said, let's take a look and see exactly how that'll work. So as you can see, we're getting through this horde pretty quickly here, and it's also pretty easy to do. There are times when you really can just stand in the group of enemies, and because of our toxic skin along with some of our witch powers, it will kill them without you really having to do anything at all. So it makes it super fun and super easy to play, and we're really not in any real danger here, as these enemies will get taken out pretty much before they even get to you. All right, so I think you guys get the gist of it. With that being said, let's go back to town and see exactly what makes this build work. So we'll go ahead and start off with our equipment first. So starting off with our helmet, we are going to be using the deflection helmet, which is just a regular legendary. And for the stats, we're looking for dexterity, maximum life, and armor as well. The reason we're using armor, even though we're well beyond the armor cap, is because we are using unyielding hits. And so with that said, we want to make sure that we have as much armor as possible to contribute to the overall damage that we're putting out. Now, when it comes to our tempers, we're going to be tempering on barrier generation and some additional total armor. And then if you're at the point where you're masterworking stuff, you can put all of 3 of your masterwork points into the total armor at the bottom, specifically the percentage. That's going to give you an overall significantly increased amount of armor than just the regular 230 armor that we have at the top. Now, the reason we're using the deflection aspect specifically is because we are using counterattack and we are using razor wings. While we don't care much about deflecting the missiles back at the enemy, deflecting the razor wings makes sure that we're using that conduit as frequently as possible, which is what allows us to have so many razor wings out on the screen at the same time. Now, when we look at our runes for this one, we are using Bach and K. We do need Earthen Bulwark for some additional barrier, and Bach allows it to trigger pretty frequently as we have some pretty good movement speed, and we are frequently going to be moving with this build. Next up, we've got our chest armor, which we will be using the apprehension aspect for. We are going to be slowing our enemies and also fearing them pretty frequently as well. So taking that additional damage that we're dealing is going to be extremely helpful. This allows us to do up to an additional 40% times damage when our enemies are feared. Now, for this guy, we want to take some dexterity, maximum life, and armor as well. So I think you're already starting to notice the pattern here. And then for our tempers, we're going to be tempering on some additional barrier generation, and we will be taking resilient as well. For our runes for this guy, we will be taking the Sem and Zik runes. This allows us to activate Concussive Stomp without taking any additional slots in our skill bar at the bottom. And we do need to make sure that A, we have as many guerrilla skills as possible in here, and B, we also need to make sure that we're using as many incarnate skills as we can as well. And so having this in here is going to be perfect. And the reason for the Concussive Stomp is we need to make sure that we're using as many guerrilla skills as possible. We already have Armored Hide, and then this is just going to be an additional layer on top of that, so that way we can trigger both our unyielding hits aspect and we can also trigger our resilient. And then if you're already at the part where you can masterwork your equipment, for this guy, I would recommend either masterworking your armor or masterworking some additional resilient on here so that we can get some additional damage output overall. Taking a look at our gloves, we're going to be using the Fell Soothsayer aspect. We are using incarnate skills and we are using them frequently. And so making our enemies vulnerable, A, is going to be really helpful. And additionally, doing some area damage is going to help out a lot, especially in cases where we're going up against either the pit or we're going into the infernal hordes. And so for the stats, we want to take maximum life, critical strike chance, and critical strike damage for this guy, where we're going to temper on critical strike damage and our vortex size. Now, we are using Vortex pretty frequently, so being able to bring all of those enemies in is very helpful, especially as this is pretty much a spin to win type of a build. If you're going to be masterworking anything on here, my recommendation is to masterwork your critical strike damage, specifically the one that you've tempered on. Once again, because this number is greater, it's going to increase your overall critical strike damage quite a bit more than masterworking the one that I've masterworked, which is only at 58% at this point. Next up, we've got our pants. For our pants, we are using the interdiction aspect. It's crazy how this aspect I can never get a perfect one of. Last season, I had a 10%. This season, I have a 10% as well. I'd love to get to 15%, but this will work just the same for now. As far as the stats, we're using dexterity, maximum life, and once again, some additional armor. And then we're going to temper on barrier generation and some additional total armor, with masterworking going into our total armor. For our gems for this guy, we are going to be using emeralds. This is just going to give us some additional dexterity, which will help us out with our overall damage output as well. Next up, we've got our boots. For the boots, we are using the Binding Morris aspect. Make sure you have the maximum evade charges for the implicit. This will be really helpful, especially as you get into the later parts of the game. For stats, we're going to be taking dexterity, maximum life, and it is very important that we're getting toxic skin on our boots, at least the minimum, which is +2 in my case here. If you can get higher, that's going to be perfect. We do want to have some movement speed for some survivability, and then we're also going to be tempering on vortex size for this one. Now, masterworking, I think this one is pretty straightforward. We want to try to masterwork all 3 points into toxic skin. Taking a look at our weapon, there's a couple of different ways to go on here, but for this version, I wanted to make sure we're not including any uniques. And so with that, we are using the redirected force aspect. We will be using a polearm for this specifically because we do want to have more vulnerable damage. You also can go with the glaive. Having the additional block chance is extremely helpful too. So either way is fine. For this one, for the stats, we want to have dexterity, maximum life, and either vulnerable damage or critical strike damage. Either one of those is fine. I managed to get one that's got a GA on vulnerable damage, and so we definitely can't go wrong there. We will then temper on critical strike damage and also ravenous. When you get to the part where you can masterwork this, you want to masterwork either your critical strike damage at the bottom or your ravenous, so you can get some additional ranks of that, which would be super helpful. And then for our gems for our weapon, we're going to be using emeralds on here as well to maximize on that overall crit strike damage. On the right hand side, and taking a look at our amulet and rings, for our amulet, we are going to be using the conceited aspect for that additional damage. We are going to have a barrier on pretty much 100% of the time with this specific build, and so that additional 45% multiplicative damage is really going to do a lot for us. Now, looking at our stats, we are taking dexterity, critical strike chance, and it is very important that we're taking cooldown reduction on here, and specifically, if you can get one that's got a GA on it, will be great. Once we have the opportunity to use mythics like the Shaco, it won't be as big of a concern. However, in order to make sure that we're not just standing there, we do need to make sure we've got some kind of cooldown reduction, and so take that wherever you can. And so cooldown reduction is really important for this. We are going to be tempering on movement speed, and we're also going to be tempering on razor wings. And I'm sure you already guessed it. When we look at our masterwork for this guy, we're going to be masterworking all 3 points into your razor wings. Now, for the gem on this one, we are going to be using Wicked Pact, which gives us some additional potency to our Eldritch powers. And so that will be helpful for now. We will be changing this a little bit later once we have the ability to craft something a little bit more powerful. And so until we can get Friend of the Bog, we will be using this one for now. Now then, taking a look at our rings, if you have a Wound Drinker, that would be perfect. We'll go ahead and use that. It gives us some good additional damage to poisoned enemies, which all of our enemies are going to be poisoned. And we're also getting some additional toxic skin on here as well, which is extremely helpful. When you're looking at masterworking this, you want to masterwork all 3 points into toxic skin if possible. If you don't have the Wound Drinker, that is absolutely fine. I didn't get this until a little bit later on in the game. You can use a regular legendary ring, and for that, we want to use this aspect that starts with a V. I don't know how to pronounce that, so you can go ahead and figure that out. However, this will give you up to 30% times additional damage when you're using your ultimate skill, and our ultimate skill really is putting this whole build together, and we will be using that very frequently, so that is very helpful. Additionally, by having a regular legendary ring, you do have the ability to temper on additional razor wings, which would be helpful too. Now, for stats, you want to have something that's got dexterity, critical strike chance, and critical strike damage, where your tempers will be, once again, razor wings and some additional crit strike damage. If you're at the point where you can masterwork this, you want to put all 3 points into razor wing charges. That will bring you at well over 18 charges, which will make this even easier to operate without really having much downtime. Now, if you don't have enough razor wings, if you're sitting at about 10 or less, you will absolutely need to have a basic skill equipped with this as well. My recommendation would be to use Withering Fist. That is a poison type of a basic skill, and also it will slow your enemies, so it'll take advantage of the slowing buffs, and it'll take advantage of your fearing buffs as well. And Withering Fist does do area damage too, so it's especially helpful when you're doing AoE type content. Now then, for the gem for this guy, we will be using Vulture's Talon. This will give our damage over time effects an opportunity to tick 50% faster, which means your poison will take effect 50% faster than it normally would. So that's really helpful to have. If you don't have these specific gems, you could always just throw in some diamonds or some skulls as well to help you with some armor and some resistances. However, this not only gives us armor and resistance, but this also will give us an additional buff as well. So super helpful to have. And then lastly, for our last piece of equipment and our second ring, we are using the unyielding hits aspect. We do use guerrilla skills, and so with that, we do want to maximize on the amount of damage that we're doing here. So that being said, we want to make sure we're taking dexterity, critical strike damage, and as we saw in the previous ring, we will be taking crit strike damage and razor wings for our tempers. Now, once you get a chance to masterwork this, once again, we want to masterwork as many points as possible into Razor Wings. And then lastly, for the gems, we are using Toadling's Wish, which makes our growth and decay witch powers 35% more potent, so that is going to be helpful. These two will stay on here even into the endgame build. However, like I mentioned, we will be replacing this one once we have a chance to get Friend of the Bog. Alrighty, so that being said, let's take a look at our witch powers that we're using. For our witch powers and for our unique witch power specifically, we're going to be using the Vengeful Spirit Servant. This not only will allow us to deal damage, but it also will take some damage away from us, and so that is going to be extremely helpful. For our other witch powers, we are using Soul Harvest. We're also going to be taking Purging Touch, along with Aura of Siphoning. We've got Lifelink, and lastly, we've got Shaken Soul as well. Now, make sure that you're getting these all the way up to level 10 while you're using these. If they're not at level 10, you're only going to be taking advantage of the initial power, but you don't have the ability to get the secondary effect that these come with. And so really important that you add those ones on as well. Next up, for our spirithall, for the first time with any Spiritborn that we've used in the past, we are going to be using centipede for our primary spirit. This will allow us to slow our enemies additionally, and we're going to be dealing additional poison damage, and this also stacks up to 8 times, which is super helpful to have. For our secondary spirit, we will be taking Gorilla. We do want to still have some maximum resolve stacks, although these have been significantly nerfed from what we saw in the last season. This is still going to be helpful overall. Taking a look at our skills, so like I mentioned in the very beginning, until you get to the point where you've got enough Razor Wing charges to be able to support this build, along with the intricacy, which will be at the bottom of the skill tree, you do want to make sure that you're using a basic skill. And so my recommendation for this would be to use Withering Fist. This is a powerful move, which also does area damage to your enemies, and so really, really helpful to have. We're going to take 4 points into this, take it up to Enhanced Withering Fist, and finish it up with Sharp Withering Fist. Next up, we're going to be skipping our core skills. We're not going to use any core skills with this build, so we'll move on over to our focus skills, where we are going to be taking Vortex, and we'll take it up to Enhanced Vortex. We're just going to take 1 point into Vortex, and then we will be taking 1 point into Mirage, and 3 points into Unrestrained Power. Next up, we've got the star of the show, which is Toxic Skin. For now, I've only got 10 points into this, but eventually expecting to see something significantly higher, closer to the 20s or possibly more. This is what's doing a majority of the damage with this specific build, so it is very important that we have as many points as possible into this. However, if you have a couple less at this point of the game, and before you start taking on tier 100 pits, this is going to be helpful. But again, this is really where we want to put a majority of our focus into. We then will take this down to Enhanced Toxic Skin and wrap it up with Measured Toxic Skin. And then on the left-hand side, we've got Focal Point for 1 point and 3 points into Apex. Moving on down to our defensive skills, we are taking 1 point into Armored Hide. Yes, it is helpful to have the passive and active portion of this. However, one of the major reasons we're using this, it's a guerrilla skill, and B, it's also an incarnate skill, and we benefit from both of those things. We will then take this up to Enhanced Armored Hide. And then moving on down, we are taking counterattack. We are using this frequently, but we only need 1 point into this, as the purpose of this mostly is just to deflect our Razor Wings back out. And of course, we also can take advantage of the additional critical strike damage that we're getting from this. We will then take this down to counterattack enhancement and wrap this up with reinforced counterattack. And then next up, we'll take 3 points into Anti-Venom. We'll then take it down to 3 points into Nourishment. We'll also be taking 1 point into Patient Guard and 3 points into Auspicious. Now then, moving on down to our potency skills, we're going to be taking 3 points into Resilient. We then will be taking just 1 point into Razor Wings. We don't need to take this all the way up to 5. Although you would think that adding more points into this will give you more damage, the point of Razor Wings really is mostly just a conduit for this build, and so we only need to put 1 point into this, which we will then take up to Enhanced Razor Wings and Invasive Razor Wings. Next up, we will be taking 3 points into Potent. And lastly, for our potency skills, we're going to take 3 points into Ravenous and 3 points into Oppressive. Moving down to our ultimate skills, we will be taking 3 points into Resolution, taking it up to Spiritual Attunement for 1 point, and then wrapping it up with 3 points into Supremacy. We also will be taking 1 point into Sustenance and 3 points into intricacy. This is what's going to allow us to reset our Razor Wings as long as Razor Wings was the last move that we used before we cast our ultimate skill. And so this is what allows us to keep going even if we don't have as many Razor Wing charges as we want to. But it is extremely important that in order to utilize that, Razor Wings is the last thing that was cast before you use your ultimate skill. Because this works with your potency and defensive skills as well, if you use something like Vortex, your Toxic Skin, it will reset that instead of your Razor Wings. And while we do want those to reset as frequently as possible as well, we just absolutely need those Razor Wings to reset more frequently. So be careful when you're using this, but it is extremely helpful. Next up, we are taking the Hunter for this. This one resets extremely fast, so really helpful to have here. We'll take it down to Harmonious Hunter and wrap it up with Exalted Hunter. And then for our passive, we will be taking Noxious Resonance for this to enhance our overall poisoning damage, and it'll also do some surrounding area damage as well. So super helpful to have, especially in AoE instances. Now, taking a look at our Paragon board, for our first glyph, we are going to be taking the Canny glyph, and we just want to take enough intelligence around this glyph just so that we can activate the additional bonus at the bottom. We'll then move on up to our second board, which is going to be Bitter Medicine, and we will be pairing this one up with Spirit. We will then move on over to our third board, which is going to be Viscous Shield, and this one we're going to be pairing up with the Menagerist glyph. We just want to take enough dex points around it just so that we can activate the additional bonus at the bottom. We will then move on over to our fourth board, which is going to be our Convergence board, and this we're going to be pairing up with the Bane glyph. We're just going to take enough points so that we can activate the additional bonus at the bottom before moving on to our fifth board, which is going to be the Drive board, and this one we're going to pair up with Fester once we have enough points to get here. However, I'm not quite at the level that'll allow me to do that just yet, but what we're going to do is we're going to make our way down and we'll grab the Fester glyph here, and then we'll grab just enough nodes so that we can go ahead and activate the additional bonus of that glyph, and then we'll make our way up towards the right before we grab Drive as well. Once you've completed all of that, then you can fill in the additional nodes around your glyph so that you can enhance the power a little bit, but for now, that's as far as we've been able to get with our Paragon board. Next up, we've got our Mercenary. For our Mercenary, we are going to be using Rahir. We're going to take Ground Slam, taking it down to Rahir's Aegis. Then we're going to take Bastion, and finally we're going to take Inspiration so that we can deal an additional 25% times increased damage both for us and also for our party members. With that said, that's all I have for you guys for today. Like I mentioned, this is mostly just an early game version of this that'll allow you to pretty quickly and easily get all the way up to T4. Be sure to stay tuned. I will be posting an updated version of this specifically just for the end game, which will also use Mythic Uniques. And like I mentioned, I will be testing out all of the different character classes, and we'll be putting out a build for basically every single character class for this season. Thank you guys so much for joining me. If you guys like this video, once again, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. That would really greatly help me out and would allow me to continue making videos like this. Thank you guys again so much for watching, and until next time, Wanderers.